Hi, everyone. I'm Padma Priya. I'm the editor and co-founder of Suno India. We are a podcast platform / network based out of India. I'm based out of Hyderabad, which is in the southern state of Telangana. And I'm a journalist by training, but I've also been a communication specialist for many years now. And in terms of trust and citizenship, wow, vast subject. But I think for me, the past few months, I think especially since I think the pandemic began, one of the things that, and even I think prior to that, one of the things that was happening a lot was the complete eroding of trust in media. And I'll speak a lot from the media perspective because I'm a journalist and I work in the space. Um, is that a lot of people look at media in India only as propaganda arms for the government or for different political parties. Almost every single political party in India has their own television channel, has their own television news channel, to be more specific. All of them have vast budgets for advertising and marketing, literally advertising and marketing. That's the only way I can put it. And what happens, and this has multiplied in the last 6-7 years, just with the change of government, with the rising, the right wing here. And it has led to a complete erosion of trust within media. But there's a flip side to it. The flip side being that those who trust media will only trust their echo chambers. They will only stick to those news channels which are feeding them that information which suits their biases. So for me, as someone who got it, we started Suno India 3 years ago. And the whole idea was that we also wanted to break out of our own echo chambers almost, which is the liberal, the so-called liberal echo chambers, as we call it, and get to the root of actually telling stories that actually need to be told, and go beyond what is being screamed at out of the television news channels every day. If any of you have a sense of how Indian news channels are, you will know that there'll be like 8 or 9 panelists during the prime time, and they will literally be screaming at each other, or the anchor basically just screaming on top of everyone. So it's Fox News multiplied by 10 times. And this is replicated across the country in different languages. So you can imagine how intense that is. And we are very small compared to these big channels. And yeah, like Prateekha is writing, it is a very intense experience just even watching it as a consumer. It's a very intense experience. And I personally have stopped watching television news. I don't watch it at all. I don't have cable network at my home. And I actually insulate myself from television news because it's very, very easy to get sucked into their propaganda. And when we started Suno India, we started it with the approach that, listen, we are going to apply the traditional journalistic rules of being objective, of doing good reporting, of bringing a good storytelling experience, and let people think what they have to think. We are not going to sit there and scream or in a podcast telling people, but this is the right thing. This is the right thing. This man is awful, or that woman is awful. We're not going to do that. We're just going to tell you this is the status of a X particular situation in India. And what we do is we do deep dives. We take one topic and then we go very deep into it. So for example, we have a podcast on tuberculosis. India has the highest burden of tuberculosis in the world. And while you'll see mainstream media covering it during the World TB Day, there is nothing which is reported on it in a very sustainable manner. So we did a 13 part episodic series, entire season on tuberculosis. And we realized that the impact of it was much greater because one, it's directly speaking, we're getting the people who are affected by it to come on it, the communities to come and speak, whether it's the patients, it's the caregivers, it's, the ones who are working in the research field, who are working in the advocacy for medicines. And we felt that this was a much more valuable and rewarding experience. And what we heard from consumers or people who were listening to our podcast was, oh shit, we didn't know it was such a big deal. Or, yeah, I survived TB, but I didn't speak up about it because of the stigma associated with it. This is just one example. And what we have done in the last 3 years is that we have slowly built our credibility and therefore trust within our, 2 million odd listeners now, in a way that they know that if Suno India is putting out content, it is content that is really well researched, it's very well reported, it's coming from the ground, and we are not screaming at the top of our voice, nor are the panelists. We don't allow that kind of stuff at all on our podcast. And we are here to tell you the story and for you to make up our mind. So this is literally what I eat and sleep and breathe on a daily basis. And I feel like it has a direct impact on how you view yourself as a citizen. And I think that is extremely important. I think what you're consuming as a news consumer directly impacts how active you are as a citizen. So if you feel that your government is doing everything right, then you'll be a very, very passive sort of a citizen. But if you are feeling angered, or if you feel moved by something that is not happening right with your taxpayer money, and if the news that is being delivered to you is not, is very well balanced, then it will give you an opportunity to think a bit deeper, and will also push you to act. And I think that for me is what I mean when I say stick to the traditional rules of journalism. Stick to what you are supposed to do. Tell both sides of the story. Let the consumer make up their mind. And I'm not saying that you have to be neutral, but be objective. I think there's like a difference there. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks so much for that wonderful introduction, Padma. And you were talking about how what you consume is definitely going to impact how you view yourself as a citizen.
Yeah.
And you talked about anger and being able to uprise and do things, but there are definitely populations who do not have the privilege of either having the resources or having any of the benefits that some of us have in society. So I know some of our other panelists work with more vulnerable populations specifically. Does anybody want to chime in here and talk about trust and citizenship at a base level before we go more specifically in to this
Could I
topic?
just chime in just to add on to that point, just one point? I think one of the reasons why a lot of people ask us, why didn't you start a YouTube channel, and why did you stick to podcasts as a medium, or why didn't you start a digital content, like articles? And one of the reasons we chose audio was because it is you don't have to be literate to understand what's being said. And we are there in different languages. We're there in different languages. We're there in 5 different languages already. And we would really love to, expand further. And that's one of the more critical reasons why we have stayed in audio, because I feel like people are much more, I think voice is very intimate. People don't get distracted with how a person is looking or with gory images. And it goes a long way in making an impact. And I just want to sort of give one very anecdotal experience that I had during the COVID lockdown that was imposed on India in last March. It was a very intense lockdown. It came upon us very suddenly, very abruptly, led millions of people stranded, migrants who ended up walking miles and miles to reach home. And one of the populations that got impacted was the Indian farmers, because this was the harvest season when the lockdown happened. And we did an episode in Telugu and in English. And one of the farmers asked me, how many people listen to this podcast? And I said, well, we currently have around, at that point, that podcast around 50,000 listeners. And he said, oh, that's a lot. And I said, we'll make sure to amplify your voice as much as I can. And he said, no, even if 15 people listen to me, that's enough. I just need people to understand what we're going through. This lockdown is horrible for us. And I think just the fact that people want to be heard and need to be heard, I think that need is where we are trying to make that platform for that voice. We believe that every voice matters. And, hey, it doesn't matter if they know sophisticated English or not. For us, it really doesn't matter.
Absolutely. It's so important to make things accessible for people to be able to participate and to take in. But I think Liam, are you going to tell us a bit about the populations you're working with in Australia?
Yeah, Padma, thank you for that soft launch into the conversation for me this afternoon in Australia. I'm interested in this idea or this notion that you just shared around people just need to be heard, right? And so people, or people just wanted to be listened to. But where I come from, particularly when we're approaching notions of trust, I'm really interested more in the notion of voice and how people find voice, because I think the being heard part and being listened to has been something that people have been talking about for a really long time. And I think if we're talking about social media and the closed feedback loop that we find ourselves in contemporary culture, that's all about, I want to be heard, I want to be listened to, but no one's really listening. So I'm going to get louder and I'm going to get brighter and I'm going to get more bold and brash. Listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. So I think there's a bit of a nuance in the way that for me, as a practitioner in this space, I think about how we nurture trust, and we nurture trust through voice. So my background, when I started my career, I'm a community development practitioner. I used to work with refugee and asylum seekers who were either moving through countries to find safe harbour, or resettling in Australia. And I found myself settling a lot of refugees in parts of rural or regional Australia where multicultural communities just didn't exist. You know, it was very monocultural. People were so far removed from the First Nations communities that they thought that colonisation was the beginning of Australia. And so for refugees and asylum seekers to be resettling in those places was a real shock to those cultures. And what I learned and what I found from my experience in those spaces was that when people were sitting with each other, whether they were working together in places of employment, whether they were learning together or their kids went to school together, people then had a voice. So people were breaking down barriers and building relationships because they were able to not just hear what other people were saying, but were able to speak back and say things like, I actually feel like you might be coming to my country and you might be bringing your ways of being, and that makes me scared. And I need you to make me understand that you're not going to try to change my way of life. And then people saying back to them, I understand that you're scared. I'm also scared. That's why I found myself in your country. I just want my kids to go to school with your kids and for us to have a roof over our heads and some sort of future that we have agency over. And those voices were speaking to each other in a way that I found to be really productive and constructive, which led me into the field of futures, and in particular, you know, my area of research is in the notion of post-normal times and post-normal times theory. And I've had the pleasure of studying under Marcus, who's with us here tonight, and with Marcus, this, you know, crafting this idea of what does it mean to tell stories, and in particular hack cultures. So get into culture and use storytelling as a way to hack culture, and then by hacking culture, you're hacking people's futures. So you're giving people an alternative view of the future that they thought they had when they were entrapped in their own culture, but through storytelling, giving them accesses to different ways of being and knowing the world, and then thinking about their future. And so tonight, you know, and for us talking about trust, I think that if we resonate on this notion that if we have a voice in the way that we tell our story, that voice will then penetrate into deeper cultures and into other cultures, which then in fact provides us opportunity to hack futures and get into different ways of thinking about the future. And I think at the moment, you know, we were, you know, I've been working with people at the Centre for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies before COVID. When COVID hit, you know, suddenly the theory gained some sort of vogue attraction, and everyone was talking about post-normal times, but it really has brought to light this notion that chaos, complexity, and contradiction are really ruling the sort of monolith of the narrative at the moment for all of us globally. And so if we're able to just pull apart what it means to tell a story and give people voice into that story, we're able to unlock opportunities for different futures for all people, and then find collaborative approaches to navigate the change. But I think the first thing we need to do is to give people voice, to then start to think about what collaboration looks like as the second step. So I might just leave it there, Sophia, if that's okay, and let others speak.
Yes, that was excellent, Marcus. I mean, sorry, Liam. And I think Prateekha would like to follow. Prateekha, so we're talking about situations, like Liam explained the situation where he was working with refugees, and there were people who were there first who said, well, I just want to, like, you've arrived in my country and I want to make sure that I'm taken care of. Yet these other people were like, I've arrived here because I'm just seeking safety and harbor. And once those stories were told in that context, these people were able to come together. But I'm wondering, what role does, in the context that you work in, do power and privilege sometimes deny people the agency to be able to tell their stories? It's not always just,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I actually want to maybe weave my response to your question with something Padma said and build on something Liam said. So sure, in my sort of day-to-day job, I do work with UNDP's regional innovation team, and much of that work is with governments and our own country offices. And then on my sort of non-UNDP hat is of an equity researcher and practitioner. And so I'm a designer. And I did a lot of work, actually, much like Liam, actually, before I joined UNDP, in the community space for a few years. But I worked largely with young people back in Canada. But I want to pick up on, so 2-3 things, and then I'll weave into this power privilege thing. I think Padma Priya, you talked about how does introspection, you said, how does introspection, no, you said, how do we, knowing yourself, what did you say? Sorry, Padma, you said what you consume shifts how you get to know yourself. And I guess I want to pivot that on the other end as well, because I think a lot about how does introspection shift what you consume. And so a lot of my work is actually on how do we get people who know they want to do differently or operate differently in their spaces, but maybe don't know where to begin. How do we actually guide that process of looking at our own ways, our mental models and mindsets, so that we actually can untangle them a little bit? And maybe Liam was starting to also get into that space a little bit with what you were saying. But how does introspection, really done critically, allow us to at least acknowledge consciously what we consume, why we consume, what is that rooted or grounded in? And the other thing I think Liam said that feels really important and ties to power and privilege is we all as people, our identities, physically and metaphysically, all come attached with different power and privilege, right? And in some context, we have greater power with that same identity, and then in another context, we don't. And that's just the very ways in which life works. But if we really were to step back and I think ask ourselves who determines what even constitutes power, we would start to get into the questions of whose knowledge? Is knowledge even power, before we ask whose knowledge? And I think this is where we're starting to get into some of the things that both of you were mentioning, right? So, how are different kinds of knowledge even accepted as power? We know in our world today, there are dominant narratives and heteronormative narratives, which disregard multiple kinds of knowledge spaces and multiple kinds of people entirely. And we can certainly go into a lot of that because that's just a global phenomenon. And we can also, and this is, there's talking about genders disregarded, women's stories, indigenous communities, Dalit communities, when you talk about caste and different, particularly India, tribal communities. And then we're still talking in the singular space. We're not even yet talking about intersectionally, all the different ways in which different communities are further marginalized from this power and privilege thing. And Liam, you had started to get at, people want to be listened, but the real thing is also how do we allow people to share their stories? When I worked with young people, particularly first or second generation immigrant communities in Canada, actually working with young people who people ask me, these young youth asked me, who even wants to hear me? Why would anyone even want to listen to me? And part of us was actually untangling and telling them, we're not just doing this because we're doing a project with you. What you offer is something we don't hear in these spaces. And what we latched onto was actually in Canada, there was an increasing movement by organizations and institutions who want to decolonize themselves. And decolonize themselves mean bring broader spaces, broader people into these communities or physical spaces. So we latched onto that by saying, okay, so you'd like to decolonize, but in practice and in actuality, what does that mean? That actually means very, very different, creating space for very different people to be in those spaces, telling their stories themselves. And so that ended up being much more of a cross-sectoral thing that we did, where we latched onto something that was happening. And in working with communities said, actually, your voices are really critical. How do we now create spaces across different sectors in the same system to actually make that happen? And so I think we also have to ask people, realize that some people don't even realize they want to be heard, they need to be heard. And I think there's something there. There's a lot of this introspection also about, deconstructing, reconstructing, that many of you, I think, have started to touch upon that I find very interesting, that I think I'll pause. Maybe the last comment I'll make, though, is as I was reflecting on this session, I was also thinking about, like, Padma Priya, you hit on this, trust is not about accuracy so much, or like, it's so much more about a facet of a relationship. And for me, trust is built with understanding and time and authenticity and vulnerability, and ultimately sharing power. And for me, sharing power requires you to be self-assured. And the ways in which our conversations are happening right now are actually latching onto insecurities, I find, more so than self-assuredness. And so, I don't know, maybe I'll pause there because I feel like there's a lot of unlearning for all of us there, but those are some of my perspectives.
Well, wow. Thank you so much. And we have the pleasure of introducing one more panelist, Yuda. Where do we begin with you? Tell us a bit more about your work in storytelling and how you have been, some projects you're excited about, or perhaps some anecdotes around the trust and citizenship work.
Sure. So I'm a science fiction writer, which means I'm a professional liar. I get to lie to people and they actually pay me for it. But jokes aside, I write science fiction, and a lot of that fiction is based on questions of what if, what happens in the next 5 years. Those are things that I'm most interested in, near future stuff. And on the other hand, I'm a data scientist and I work in public policy for a think tank called Learn Asia. We operate primarily in the global south. So a lot of what I do there is almost the opposite of science fiction, which is to take data, to take the noise of all sorts of data sets, from call detail records to satellite imagery, and try and figure out, right, how do we use this data to make sane and sensible policy that works for everyone? Like our framing is pro-poor. Like, how do we make sure that people at the bottom of the pyramid aren't consistently screwed over by our governments, which they usually are? And as of late, I have shifted towards merging the two, which is looking at, particularly as part of Edgeriders, as part of the Science Fiction Economics Lab, looking out at the world, at larger systems, like this whole idea that there are some things that we cannot change. There are some things that are going to hit us in the face, no matter how optimistic we are about it. We are going to face market uncertainties. We are going to face externalities. We are going to face financial collapses. We are going to face climate change, despite the fact that we still keep trying to say, oh, right, maybe by 2030, we'll get out of oil by 2030. No, it's too late. We are completely screwed, right? This is going to happen. So when stuff happens, what then? What economic systems do we have? What alternate social contracts can we embrace? Like, if one way of life isn't working, what the hell do we do after the system collapses? So in that spirit, as part of my work with Edgeriders, I've been looking at alternate social contracts, looking out at the world around us, looking out at broken systems, looking out at people coming up with all sorts of interesting alternatives, from Marina Leda in Spain to Vietnamese co-ops, and going and using the skills that are built in fiction really to imagine, right, what would a society look like if we use these underlying social contracts to build something out of it? What would people's lives look like? What would the lives of the everyman look like? And what would the lives of the top-down policymaker look like? To imagine every possible slice of a society and go, right, where do people fit in? Is this society capable of fitting all the sorts of people that, all the various and interesting people that actually are going to exist in this world? Because you can't build societies that work only for one slice of people. That's the problem. That's what's got us into this mess in the first place. So I think so. A lot of my stuff, and I also work in misinformation. I run a startup that is a free fact-checking service called Watchdog. We've been working on various stuff since the 2019 April bombings in Sri Lanka, where a couple of hundred people died, in need of the hour stuff. So a lot of my work coalesces around narrative, because I've come to believe that narrative is storytelling, rather, is the single greatest tool that we humans have. It's not intelligence, not necessarily. I used to believe that, logic was fantastic. I used to believe that rationality was the greatest thing that we had, until I started looking out at the world a bit more and realizing that people do all sorts of stuff for reasons that don't make logical sense, but make narrative sense. Because there are narratives that they work on. If you open a book of religion, you will see all sorts of fantastic narratives that not just push us into wars, but help us live lives that have some profound meaning to ourselves. If you look at economics, if you look at classical economics, well, most of that has been a narrative that, the works of Kahneman and Tversky are slowly overturning. And even that is still a narrative built on sub-narratives. If you look at money, we tell ourselves, right, this piece of paper is worth this amount of sweat off a man's back, and now we will trade and we will act as if this completely virtual abstraction is real. And it works. We build societies on this stuff because we build narratives. And I've come to understand human beings as little engines that trade narratives back and forth. And some narratives gain power over others, some get completely washed out, some actually when and those often those narratives, when these larger dominating grand scale narratives break, you find these smaller narratives bubbling up to the surface and going, right, lads, the dinosaurs are gone, maybe the mammals can come back again. So that's more or less the stuff I'm in. And one thing we've seen with COVID, like I live in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is, depending on who you ask, it's one of the best country to live in or the worst country to live in. I maintain that it's a fantastic country if you took the Sri Lankans out of it. So we have beautiful beaches, ruins, everything that you could possibly want. And politicians, let's just say that there are colonies of bacteria on the Red Sea that are marginally more competent than the Sri Lankan politicians. So one of the things we've seen, of course, as a result of recent times, particularly COVID-19, is a complete breakdown of many of the narratives that brought the people in power today to the places that they are. We've seen complete just destruction of all the lovely little stories that we piled up on top of each other. And one of the things, and of course, this means that trust has been significantly eroded. So I'm not going to come out and say, hey, I know how to get governments to trust people and people to trust governments and so on and so forth. That seems like far too large an intellectual gap for any person to fill. But one of the things that we've consistently seen is that a lack of, even more than a lack of effort, sorry, let me step back and rephrase. Even more than a lack of results, a lack of apparent effort breaks trust. And we've seen that in Sri Lanka over and over again. And the lack of alternatives breaks trust. Now, I don't necessarily know what to do about lack of effort on the part of government. I mean, for that, maybe a cattle prod and some bullets in the face of politicians. That's always been Sri Lanka's traditional way of dealing with these things, always more bullets. But with regards to alternatives, one thing we've seen is that, as I came before to this point about these large-scale narratives that we use to run our governments, that policymakers use, what we see is that when these systems break, there's just panic. There's no alternate set of narratives that people can reach out to. There are, let me correct myself, there are alternate sets of narratives that people can reach out to, but they don't, because we consistently fail to plan for failure. We know things are never going to stay constant. We know this Jenga tower is going to collapse at some point, but we keep acting as if it won't, and we do not make plans to deal with failure. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is, would it be possible to take a whole bunch of, first, when designing policies and when designing systems, to ask ourselves, okay, this policy will work to do X. What happens if this fails? What happens if there are these adverse events? Can we plan for those adverse events? Can we have alternate systems and alternate ways of thinking, which are all around us? Can we spin them up, so to speak, and have them running almost in parallel so that we can observe what happens when this policy is put into effect or not? What I'm essentially talking about would be familiar to any marketer, ironically, or any software engineer, which is A/B testing. If we want to bring about a new policy, or if we want to bring about a new shift in attitudes, can we test it out in a microcosm? Can we then study it, see what happens, and then scale it out if it's successful? Can we not just test one theory out or one overwhelming narrative out, but a plurality of narratives and put them into practice in microcosms, actually see how these things pan out and go, right, this idea seems to be working, let's try and use that. This idea seems to be working, let's try and use that. So I would say, for circling back to the question of trust, a narrative pool is actually a fantastic concept. Almost think of it as narratives as genes that let us, whatever unit you want us to be, whether it's a family, it's a nation state, or the human race as a whole. Narratives as genes that we constantly, sometimes follow down dark paths and dead ends, and sometimes we follow into the light and keep working for one day ahead. So there are a few ideas that, of course, that I have on the table based on some work we've done, but I'll stop here and I'll pass it over. I'll pass the discussion over to the rest of you.
Yuda, for a second there, Yuda, I thought you were talking about jeans like the pants you wear, and I thought, wow, we're getting really. He's going to drag out a nice metaphor.
Oh yeah,
here.
Levi's is going to save us all.
You know, your lowrider Levi's, and hey, but I'm going to deliberately segue off a thought that you've done there across to my dear friend Marcus, because what Marcus will tell us is that stories are nurtured through the imagination, and imagination is deeply embedded in culture. And so with the imagination embedded in culture, and imagination the fertilizer for good stories and storytelling, and as you say, the guide to all culture, what does that, you know, reflecting on the imagination, what does that mean for us, Marcus?
You're asking me.
Yeah, man. Oh, we want to hear from you. You're the guru.
No. Look, I've played with narrative all my life. To me, the mythic is the substrata of all consciousness. And this is one of the reasons why when Sahel in Ayatollah first proposed CLA, I jumped on it straight away, because he identified the mythic as a sort of the ontological, as the sort of the source core root of meaning, and meaning not at the intellectual level, but at that sort of drive, that primal level. So for me, you know, I think of narrative and I think of imagination as kind of like the magma that lies underneath culture, just like it sits beneath the crust of the earth. And it's constantly moving, it's constantly being reconfigured, hybridized, whatever the current sexy terms might be for it, but that it actually propels people. So that rationality is a narrative construct. So what's rational to a Nazi or a fascist is deeply rational to them. It's not just that they, I mean, there's always a level of cynicism. I think we know that there's processes that we sort of kidnap and we manipulate, but, you know, and at the same time, reason is something that emerges out of values, out of beliefs, and deeply out of that which is the bedrock. And that, to me, is the narrative consciousness stuff, which is never singular.
And I think that speaks to the idea before around that power and privilege notion, right? Like power and privilege, who has a voice, who doesn't have a voice, whose voice is louder, you know, it is rooted, particularly in modernity, to the deeply rational at the moment. Like, what is rational? What is logical? What is scientific? What is reason? Okay, well, those people get more weight in the argument. Their stories are louder, their stories are more powerful. And those are, you know, others are more and more vulnerable and more isolated. However, then COVID comes up, and then we realize we're all as equally as fragile as each other. And then we all start to grasp at some sort of grasp for some sort of relevance in the fluidity of the change and the uncertainty. So as we grasp for relevance, more and more tribalism comes up, and there's tribalism within tribalism, more and more rifts and fractures. And then we find ourselves here in September 2021.
There's also an interesting question to be asked about hybridity, right? Like a lot of the discussion around narratives that we see sort of tries to bucket narratives as, all right, here's one, and here's one specific line, here's another one, this is more powerful than the other, and so on and so forth. But in reality, we hybridize so many of all the narratives that we come across. We tune them, we adapt them, we shift them here and there. Here's a good example.
Colonize them. They get colonized.
I wouldn't necessarily use the word colonizing, as coming from a country that was repeatedly colonized. Yes, that happens. But let me show you an example from the other side. Let's take Ayurveda, Sri Lankan herbal medicine, right?
Yeah.
A fantastic tool. I've had this hand completely shattered, bones broken, coming out, and once it was repaired by surgeons at the General Hospital, it was actually Ayurvedic treatment that got the hand moving again. Because until it still doesn't move properly, but there's utility in that. Now, when COVID broke out, we had this sudden rash of Ayurvedic doctors in Sri Lanka who claimed to have cured COVID. And they were running around with the little pots and saying, right, I cured COVID in this blender. And you had thousands and hundreds of thousands of people flocking to get these cures. And as a result, getting COVID just by standing in line. So would I say that Ayurveda was useful in that sense? No, there is clear bullshit happening there. But would I discount it completely? Not really. In practice, what's turned out to be useful is a mix of both. Go get your Western medicine for your pills, your fractures. If you want to figure out why your muscles aren't working or why your joints hurt or you have arthritis, here's something that's worked for a couple of thousand years, right? And if you look at most of the people in Sri Lanka, they're hybrids, right? We're all hybrids. Right? We speak in Sinhala, we wear jeans and t-shirts. We read English when we need to. We embrace other traditions and other stories and other narratives when we need to. And we take, by and large, most people take what's useful to them to get their lives done and go on with it. And I think there's incredible value in that. Because when we think of political systems, when we think of policymaking, we usually start by setting out a rigid framework of thought and saying, right, this is the hill we shall die on. These are the principles on which this thought rests, and working from there almost by saying these are axioms of thought. But most people getting through their lives shift all the time. They take whatever is convenient. I'm wondering if that might actually be worth embracing a lot more in how we think of futures.
I just want to sort of chime in there because I think Yudha brings a very interesting point about when he spoke about Ayurveda. I was just nodding my head here. Because this is a very interesting experience and, also very similar experience to what we are seeing here in India, where, after COVID came out, you had this entire section of what we call as the Ayush. So this is the Ayurveda, Unani, the Siddha, the different kinds, the traditional or the alternative forms of medicine. Whereas people will say, hey, those are actually the mainstream medicine and, Western medicine is a construct. Anyway, let's not go there. But, those people, they started, that there was this entire influx of like, take this for your immunity, take this for COVID. And we had a very famous case of one of the very famous Babas or the gurus here coming out with a so-called drug called Coronil. And what he did was he basically used a moment of intense insecurity within this time frame of COVID. And he used really brilliant marketing to market unscientific sort of, medicine. And people bought it. And you had to have and then the doctors were like, hello, what is going on? You can't just market it out there. This is not even certified. This is not even been researched. But he got his job done. He sold millions of that medicine off the racks. It was sold out. And he was feeding into a narrative. He was feeding into insecurity. He was feeding into a narrative that this Ayurveda medicine Ayurveda is so ancient. It is so long drawn. It has all the answers, and it might have the answers. I'm not discrediting it. And for me, and around this time, there was a lot of discourse also with the Indian government wanting to also give Ayurvedic doctors, permission to do surgeries. And this became like a huge debate within India, and this is in the middle of the first wave of COVID. There were the doctors versus the Ayurveda specialists fighting among each other. And I had to go out of my comfort zone and I wanted to go and actually talk to people and understand what was happening. And what came out was very, very interesting. The fact that there are not enough doctors for the population of India, of 1.3 billion Indians, there are not enough doctors. And a lot of these Ayurveda doctors, the Unani doctors, double up as doctors in many of the rural parts of India. They do with their limited knowledge, with their limited, their knowledge in that subject. They do double up as doctors. They do double up as so-called allopathic doctors. And so this is where, how do you go and tell an entire population of people, you cannot trust this Ayurveda doctor, you cannot trust this Unani doctor? Yes, Prateeksha, he did falsely claim it. Absolutely. That was a huge false claim. And, it was falsely claimed. It was, supported by the ministry and then had to roll back. Absolutely, there is. But for me, at the core of why people believed it is because it came at a time when people were feeling very insecure, and because Ayurveda is very cultural. It's also very driven by religion of Hinduism, right? So it is something that we are taught growing up, like, oh, just get some turmeric from your kitchen and add it to your milk if you have a sore throat. Like, it's something that we're just brought up with. So it's so much within your culture. So how do you fight these kind of narratives? So I went ahead and did like this 2-part series on what is the truth behind it, like just going and talking to people, talking to doctors. And it was a very interesting sort of an outcome that came out, like with Ayurveda doctors and Unani doctors saying, like, we are not given the respect that we should rightfully be given, because hello, we do treat people. These are the testimonies, like Yudha just said, like, I am somebody who took Ayurvedic treatment for my lower back issues, and there are many, many testimonies out there. So how do you fight these? So these are like literally narratives being pitted against each other, right? Like, that's what's happening. Like, in a lot of the cases, for me as a journalist, what I see is that there is narrative A versus narrative B, and how does a normal person make sense of these narratives, right? And I completely agree with Prateekha said. Like, I think introspection, like you introspect, therefore, as a consumer of whatever, of social media, whatever consumption you're doing, you have to introspect, and then you have to think in terms of, okay, what is right for me, or what is right for me as a citizen to take on? And there were not many who actually came out against this Baba and his false claims. I mean, you literally had to have. He went on to say the WHO, also approved the medicine. You literally had to have the WHO say, hello, nothing of that sort happened. So this is how powerful narratives can be, because they are actually getting into the psyche. They are targeting the psyche of a people. It's confirmation bias at the best, right? I mean, this confirming what you have always believed in. So
we had the Minister of Health running around with this stuff and actually taking it and endorsing it. And ironically, that action at the time did not seem to degrade trust in the government at all. It was when people's livelihoods started getting affected that started decay. But it had nothing to do with the BS being sold.
Yeah. And I think we saw this within COVID, not just with Ayurveda, but also with the Western medicines. You suddenly had the malaria drug being marketed. You suddenly had ivermectin marketed. You had all kinds of remdesivir being marketed. I mean, it was like a cocktail of medicines being marketed, saying this can treat you, this can treat you, this can treat you. But, in reality, we all know that ultimately what saves you from COVID is your own immune system, and maybe to some extent, the supportive treatment that you get. So, and I think you rightly pointed out, for us in India, I think the second wave was when people started waking up and questioning the government and its handling of all these kind of misinformation and this whole, their whole stress of, they were literally tweeting out saying, have ginger and lemon. I'm not even kidding about this. Like, so it literally took the second wave for people to wake up. It was literally like a huge wake up call for people when their own family members and neighbors were dying, for people to wake up and say that, but hello, what are you guys doing? Where is the oxygen? Like, we don't need ginger now, we need oxygen now, right? So it actually takes a lot for people to snap out of it. That's honestly what I can say. It takes a lot of push for people to snap out of it.
Prateekha.
Thanks. So I was going to pick up on a few threads. Hopefully they're all still holding in my brain, and I should have been taking notes a few minutes into this. But I was going to pick up on the thread of, actually, I think it was by June, how do we actually get more people to partake in, like, telling their stories, right? And this is where we will now know if my brain remembers the points that I had made, which did make a lot of sense a few minutes ago. Which was a point that we had actually been discussing as a panel just before the panel started for me, which was around how do we actually, first of all introspect on our own power and privilege in any situation that we walk into? Because actually for all of us in this room, we actually have an immense amount of power and privilege. So whose stories do we amplify is a conscious choice. Who do we listen to? Who do we tweet and retweet? These are small things, but when you have followings or when you have an audience, even these small steps actually allow you to have more people partake in a discussion. Two, I really think stories, we've been having this discussion on how narratives are grounded in cultures. And then there was this whole discussion of actually when cultures though are built on stories, that have been like intentionally or purposefully been told from a particular angle or way, how much can we trust culture by itself as the origin point? And so this for me is why when we talk about diversity, I feel like we talk about diversity about, you know, colors and genders, you know, more like things you can see. But I think that other space that stories do is allow for diversity in terms of your worldviews and your sort of you know, invisible, the things that you hold inside of you. You may look just like everybody else. When I'm in India, I'm just another brown person in a sea of brown, you know? And so by looking at me, you may not actually think, does she think very differently about XYZ? I can tell you that I do in some ways around, you know, others around me. But you won't know that until you give me the space. And I actually have that privilege to create my own space. So first is that notion of stories actually are not just about diversity of voices from a very literal sense. There are diversity of worldviews. And actually it's the diversity of worldviews that topple, you know, dominant systems. And so that's why we need more spaces to tell those stories that are critical, critiquing, opposing. And I think that just for me is something really, really important, which is where I think where you were talking about fiction. I'm going to say fiction, not just science fiction, because sometimes for me, science fiction prioritizes certain angle points that, and like technology, science fiction has always had this very interconnected relationship to science and tech, which
I think in the 60s or 70s, there was this massive push from people like Isaac Asimov and so on and so forth, the Americans. And there was this push of like, oh, hard science fiction, raw. But a lot of us working in science fiction now, particularly a lot of us working outside the US, have never actually been bound by that tradition. Social systems and economies are just as interesting, if not more, than what material the rocket is made out of. I would say far more interesting.
I'm also talking like, you know, the way movies push the narrative is still very much held in that Western framing. And that influences a lot of people because regardless of your culture, you watch those movies, which is probably why we need more spaces like yours and stories like yours to start to proliferate, just like we see Latinx and a lot of Indigenous X movements, and we see Suno India providing voices. So I just wanted to, say that, which was, how do we have multiple kinds of stories that tell different worldviews? And then I'll stop there because I forgot the last part of where I was going to
agree with you.
go with this. And
I
I'll hand it
completely
over.
agree with that. Something I've seen in science fiction spaces as well, where diversity is checkboxed, right? It's like, do we have one brown person? Yay, cool, done. The point I always make is that, you know, if you're gonna have, because we run into this all the time, right? Publishers on the lookout for diverse stories for anthologies and so on and so forth. And the thing I always say is, if you hire, say 10 brown people from the same block in New York and call that, and that's not diversity, you're just getting the same damn story with a little bit of makeup on top. That's lipstick on a pig. If you want actual diversity, you need to get narrative diversity. You need to get people who come from very different walks of life and have very different ways of processing the same information. And you need to see if people, if given this, and like the test of diversity is, if given this information or this set of facts or theories or stories about the world, will they reply in the same way? Will the output be the same? If not, then that's a diverse crowd. If it is the same stuff, then you kind of locked yourself into an echo chamber, and that's no use to anyone.
Yeah, and I think, sorry.
No, go for it.
I was just going to say, I think, you know, and Marcus and I have done some work in this space around, you know, community engagement and how you engage a diversity of voices into spaces, you know, and albeit sort of it's fairly embryonic in our thinking, but, you know, we talk a lot in post-normal times theory about this notion of wisdom communities and how do you mobilize polylogs where a diversity of agendas and voices are able to come in a way where there's mutually assured diversity, is what Sardar calls it. You know, this notion that you come with your own identity and you are assured that your diversity is going to be accepted and embraced, albeit easier said than done in a lot of ways. But how we actualize that concept is quite fascinating to me, and I think is something that people have been trying to do in community development for a long time. I think what's most fascinating to me at the moment, and just riffing off Padma's point around, and your sort of anecdote around the Indian context and what's happened in India around the Baba and, claiming who's, certification. To me, the notion of trust is over now. Like we when we talk about trust, we need to rethink what we mean by trust. And I'm quite fascinated by this notion of fast trust, that we are moving so fast at the moment that we need to think about trust as a process that needs to move as fast or faster than the context that's working within, to ensure it's one step ahead, so that these voices may remain welcomed and embraced and facilitated in a way that's meaningful in those conversations. And at B, where I work at the moment, we've been talking a lot about the notion of voice and giving people purpose when they come and they show up and share their voice, and then reflecting back to them the outcomes or the evidence of what we've seen and heard and then done when they've shared their voice with us, and doing that really quickly. So that's underpinned by a strong communications piece. So we're always talking to people, and we're always trying to have people talk to us. Essentially, the major KPI for us is when you call a meeting, people show up and they talk, and then we will go back and tell them what we've done, and then we will ask them to come and talk to us again, and we will just keep doing that while the sands are shifting so rapidly beneath all of us, to ensure that at least there's some spaces for people to come together and share stuff. So I think the notion of trust is dying, if not dead already, and we need to reimagine what trust looks like into the future if we're going to have any success in this space.
I was going to add a comment to that, which was this notion of also, certainly reimagining trust, but how do we also trust our institutions around us by asking or demanding that actually they all shift away from this monolithic identity that they latch onto? And we see this, maybe, Padma Priya, you can talk about this, right? Where our media channels, especially, you can speak specifically from an Indian perspective, Liam, and Yudha, you can probably speak from, your own countries, but media spaces are monolithic largely. And, politics, business, entertainment. And so I think this notion of actually as consumers, I think a lot about our power. Every dollar we spend is a vote in the world we want to see. And we spend, any currency. Anytime you spend money, you vote for a world, right? And so how are we actually voting for our worlds very differently by this thing that we do every day? And if we did it more consciously, is that one other way where maybe we're not telling those stories, but we're actually creating the space for those stories because companies cannot survive without us? And so is that something also as an action we can take tomorrow, which is also demanding those companies to be much more, or those spaces rather, not just companies, to be much more representative, and use our capital in a very, very instrumental way.
I want to add to that, if possible, just to add to Prateekha's point of sort of being conscious about what we do with our time. And to go off Liam's point of trust possibly being dead already, what we always see in storytelling, whether it's a construction of a novel, a film, or just a conversation between people, is that if people act like it's true, it's going to become true. And this is me trying not to paraphrase Goebbels, by the way. I'm not saying repeat something until it becomes the truth. I'm saying that one of the tools we have in fiction is, if you want to portray a character, you can tell the reader that this person is awesome, a murderer or whatnot, right? But that's less effective than letting the reader see other characters' reactions to this person. Do they react as if he's a murderer? Do they react as if he's awesome? That imprints itself far more. So I think in the real world, if you can build narratives, and if you can convince people, they may be small units of people, they may be your family, maybe your workplace, maybe small coalitions of people, to act as if those narratives hold true, then you will find that trust is possible. Trust is possible as long as people share the same story, right? Where people have the same narrative background, they trust each other. Where people have the same points that they can latch onto and the same stories that underpin their behavior, there's trust. The more people you get on the same story, and the more effective you can be at taking a series of stories that will change behavior, the more effective you're going to get. And if you can change the story behind a bunch of people, then you can change how they will interact with the world. If you want a fairer world, we need to change the stories that people have in their minds that makes them act the way they do.
Yet
Just
we
taking
see
off from just one point in terms of the representation part, I think this is something that, and I sort of want to also reflect on the power and privilege part of, like, even for us as India, this is something that, we are a very small team. We are 6 members, but we work with contributors, independent journalists from across the country. And one of the things that we are very consciously trying to do is how do we increase the representation or the diversity even within this pool of people that we are working with. And it's not easy. It's actually quite hard, because I come from a very privileged space of being an upper caste woman and who is heading a platform, who in that sense is the editor and who holds the power to say yes or no to which story makes the cut to my platform. And for me, when I do reach out to people with diverse backgrounds, there is always this, I always have this struggle, or I take a step back in how do I even frame my request on, hey, come pitch a story to me, right? It's more like I actually go and tell them, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to build a platform which is much more diverse, much more representative of the nation that I'm part of. And here's the mic. Do what you want to do with it. Tell the stories that you want to tell. And not everybody takes that mic easily. And that, again, I think comes back to Liam's point about how do we get these people to even tell their stories? Like, and I think there is also a very huge element of trust there. And I think, Prateeksha, you will understand where I'm coming from. I think more because from the caste angle, I think it's not easy for somebody who has been oppressed for really long time to actually place their trust in a platform that is, say, headed by upper caste people. And if you look at how the media landscape is in India, and I can talk about maybe also, I think South Asia, I could perhaps speak, I can speak for that. It is largely headed by the more privileged castes. And therefore, how are you expecting people from oppressed castes to also come and place their trust in you? How do you build that trust, therefore, among the minority communities to come and, how do you make this a more collaborative process? And I think we've been more successful in that sense with colleagues from Kashmir, in sort of just saying that, where we say, we are not getting the stories that need to be told from this place. And here's what, and we would really love to give the space to you. Tell us what kind of stories you would love to tell. And it is a journey, it is a process. You have to build trust between each other. And sometimes it works, sometimes it won't work. And I don't think trust is lost. I don't think trust is gone, but I think it's a slow process. I actually don't think it's a fast process. I actually think it's a quite slow process to just build that trust between two different, almost opposite sort of communities, and tell them, hey, here's what we would love to do with you. We would love to work with you. And brings me to a point of, I was having this conversation with a very senior journalist and a very good friend of mine, who's also a Dalit rights activist. And when I was speaking to her and I asked her, hey, would you be willing to do this? I would like to get some stories on this. And she said, the kind of stories I would really like to tell would be far from what the mainstream media talks about Dalit lives, which is about this ex-Dalit woman being raped or this happening or that, only the bad things. She said, I want to actually tell the stories of how we live. I want to tell the stories of this amazing Dalit woman who sings every single day, and and she's become like she's become super popular on TikTok, or really incredible positive stories. And for me, that was like, yes, I will never know of these stories because I don't belong to that community. I will never know of these stories because my lens is only from that of, oh my God, this is an oppressed community and all they have is really tragic stories to tell. And in some way, you're almost what I would say as selling poverty porn or trauma porn, right? So how do you move away from that? How do you move away from it and make this a very positive experience? Not really positive experience, but how do you actually record these stories? How do you use that storytelling to tell people we live, we exist? And I think one of the ways we did that, one of our podcasts, which I'm extremely proud of, is the podcast on rare lives, on people living with rare diseases. And again, this is this is actually a huge community within India, but hardly visible, hardly seen, hardly spoken about. We gave the mic to all, passed on, we asked someone who is living with a rare disease to literally, come up with, conceptualize the podcast. We helped her with it. And oh my God, the kind of testimonies that came out, the kind of storytelling that came out, it was just brilliant. This is not something that I could have done living in my own privileged ableist bubble, So yeah, it is almost like a tango, right? It's like a lovely dance. And I see the June is talking about dance partners here. So yeah, trust is a long way to go, literally. Yeah, how do you, I love what June just wrote here. How do you not don't intentionally or maliciously touch them? They need to listen to the melodies. I love the way you framed this, June, and I think you've done a fantastic job of framing my thought. Yeah.
June, if you don't mind, I'm going to steal that and put that in a book someday. That's very poetic.
It is.
Liam, did you have a
response
response to the fast trust?
Yeah, no,
I think it was kind of like, yeah.
Yeah, I will respectfully disagree, I think, with both Yuda and Padma on this one, because I think that what you're holding on to is the cultural narrative of what trust has been for us, and doing that thing that is, well, this is what trust has been, and it's an enduring trait or characteristic that we need to re-find or rediscover or hold on to get us through these trying times, when you get a whole heap of people lining up and listening to your baba and taking the stuff. Do you know what I mean? And you get people in my country finding people on the internet and having sex with them within 5 minutes of communicating with them. Do you know what I mean? Like, we get fast food. What is it about me that makes me show up and say I need to get brain surgery, and I meet the brain surgeon just before I go to sleep, and trust that they're going to do something that to operate on my brain, because they have an authoritative position in this space, and there's a dialogue between me and a cultural contract between me and the surgeon, and that's a fast trust piece. I've got no choice there. It's either Sophia's going to operate on my brain or the surgeon. Sorry, Sophia, you're cool, but I'm taking the surgeon every time, because there's and it's the same. So what is going on in that process? There's an absolute cultural process that's happening globally for all of us at the moment, and we're seeing it play out in ways that are benevolent, the brain surgeon, and malevolent, the Baba in India doing. And that's what I'm saying. And I think if we understand that process better, we can actually get ahead of it. And that's why I'm saying we need to let go of notions of trust that existed before as enduring, monolithic, these pillars of our institution, because it doesn't work anymore. Unless we get a grasp on that, we've got no way of reimagining an alternative future, if that makes sense.
I don't necessarily see that as a disagreement, Liam. I agree with you on this, because when we say trust, I don't necessarily mean trust in the halls of policy or in the ivory tower and institutions of that nature. Trust happens between people, between communities, and between like shared ideas and narratives, right? That can be anything. That often is anything. Like, Sri Lanka just came out of a 30-year civil war. And the most interesting thing to me was looking up all the paramilitary groups that formed inside of this 30-year conflict that ended in 2009, and trying to understand what made these people, this particular set of people, follow X person, this particular set of people follow Y. And it's not because they often it's not because they had station or anything of the sort. It's because someone there had a good story, and someone there had, was able to rally people around a story and go, right, boys, we're going to die, but let's shoot those other people at it. We might just win. Yeah.
And I completely agree with you, Liam. I think there's no disagreement there. I think my space of where I was talking about trust was actually coming from between communities, and how do you build that? Like, again, I think I was taking off from Prateekha's also point of representation and the whole discussion around privilege. And I think for me, that's deeply entrained. It is around maybe the cultural notion of trust, the old trust. And I think I got what you meant by fast trust now. Yeah.
Pratt? Uh-oh. Did I freeze?
New clarity the systems, political, economic, social, ecological, in which we are immersed as they change around us. We see what's strong, what's weak, what's corrupt, what matters and what doesn't. What is weak breaks under new pressure, what is strong holds, and what is hidden emerges. And maybe in this notion of trust and narrative and stories, there's something interesting there, which is at this point in time, what are the stories we're seeing actually just collapse? And what are the things that we're seeing hidden that are reemerging? And what are we seeing, that's weak breaking? And is that a place for us, to jump off
such
of?
such a beautiful point. Yeah, lovely. Well said.
So before we came into this main room, we were also talking about the stories that were being told, and we were touching upon, like, for example, the subject of Ayurveda came up. And this is why I actually intentionally went and found some Indian participants, because I live in Bali. I'm very interested in the confluence and collision of spirituality, governance, and everything that's been happening as of recently. So one of the questions that I have for all of you is talking about traditionally excluded voices or other epistemologies, ways of knowing and being that in these times are being sought out. Now, I feel that I would love to hear your stories about some of some of the narratives that have been emerging out of this, because there's one way to see it in that, for example, the yoga world are some of the biggest perpetrators of disaster spirituality and conspiracies, right? So this ancient wisdom and technologies have been appropriated or misappropriated and used in different ways. But yet we're also seeing increased interest in indigenous ways of knowing. So I would love for you to talk about some experiences that you've had there, and what are some ways we can cultivate trust in those communities, because there hasn't exactly been a reciprocation or reciprocal relationships in all these instances, right? So.
That killed the conversation.
We did touch on that. We were talking before we jumped on about that. One of the things I'm really conscious of, as a white male in Australia, is of our deep colonial history, and one of the things that we talk about a lot is about, when I talk to First Nations communities or First Nations people, is the notion of nothing about us without us. So I think that it's important to acknowledge that none of us, certainly from my perspective in the country that I stand on at the moment, my lineage is colonial, so it's hard for me to speak from that perspective. But I also noted before, Prateekha, your notion of amplifying voices and amplifying agendas, in particular conversations. And I think it's worth acknowledging that, when we're thinking about the way that we can approach voice and the way that we can approach diversity in conversation, it's really important that we also approach the different ways that different cultures do communicate, and that often when we're seeking to facilitate that power and privilege, in just simply acknowledging the fact that people communicate differently across cultures, we can think of different ways to invite in. And it's going to spaces where different cultures are, or communicating in different ways, and accepting that those different ways don't necessarily align with our ways of knowing, but that's okay. And that's almost like the reverse culture hack. That's opening yourself up to different ways of hacking your own culture, if that makes sense. So I think for me, that's sort of the way that I would approach this conversation. Is that fair?
And just to add to this, is that whenever I go to some of these conferences where roughly similar discussions are happening about, power, privilege, personality, narrative, there's this constant refrain of, oh, we need to think beyond this narrative. We need to go beyond. We need to think of other narratives. And what I'll stick my oar in and say before I shut up is this: there are plenty of other narratives existing in the world. And I've gotten tired up to, I've gotten completely tired of hearing people say, like, we need to think about these narratives, and then showing up the next year and saying the same goddamn thing again. There are plenty of narratives out there in the world. Usually when someone says we need to think about those narratives, it usually means that someone that they listen to hasn't come across that narrative, hasn't heard about it. But if we actually look out at the world, there are all sorts of interesting things to observe and to take lessons from. And I'll give a microcosm example. When we were working on Witness, which is alternate economies, post-climate change future stuff, like what kind of social contracts would change. Sorry. One of the most interesting things was, like, we were looking at what kinds of economies would exist, right? And of course, my mind immediately went to, right, peak cyberpunk, night city, ultra-libertarian minarchy state. That's definitely going to be a thing because so many people are pushing for it. And then one of the economists on the project came along, and while I was constructing that world, came along and said, have you considered religion? Have you considered Byzantine worker economies? I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Do you mean that the Vatican is a model? And he actually pointed out that religious economies from the 13th and 14th centuries were able to conceive of multi-generational projects and execute them and put them into place, like create monuments that stood the test of thousands of years, in ways that today's market-led thinking and short-term needs, shareholder-led thinking rather, could not. And while this is not an advocation for a religious autocracy, it was an interesting point to think about. Like, there has been an alternate structure that has worked. There is an alternate narrative that has worked. Is there a way to take that, to hybridize it, to take the best of what we have learned today and take lessons from this other story that's going on and figure out a better way forward? We did the same by looking at Marina Leda in Spain, a tiny village that said, screw this, the economy is dying, our people aren't happy, farmers and people are getting screwed over. Let's imagine something else. We did the same with Vietnamese cooperatives where they realized that they couldn't compete with vast amounts of capital and went, right, how do we go about doing this? So there are plenty of these stories out there. And economics is just a microcosm example. There's so many other aspects to the world. And I think we should actually commit to looking for them and bringing them out to the light and actually putting them into these spaces. And I think that'll be a good step forward, because people will start then converting that to action.
Thank you.
And my cat will hopefully stop running over me all the time.
Yes, so that's exactly what I'm talking about here. I loved what Lisa said very, very early on in the conversation. And this is about the lack of equity and imagination. And this is for economic reasons. This is for several other reasons. So now that we're nearing the end of the time, can you all share some of your food for all recipes, some of the more creative processes you've been involved in that are helping to present alternative ways of telling stories and giving people voice and language to tell those stories? So what's before us and what's emerging in some of the work that you're doing? If we're transcending these old notions of trust and how we used to build it and how we used to give people voice and agency, what are we doing now and what can we do more of to ensure there's food for all and everybody is eating?
Oof, that's a very big ask.
Yeah, look, at the risk, this is the thing that's on my mind at the moment. Has been for a couple of years now. Is and I'm not sure how this lands with the rest of the thread of my conversation this evening, but I'll lay it on the table for the conversation. I'm really interested in talking to people who aren't marginalized, who aren't isolated, who aren't Indigenous, because I think that they're our biggest problem at the moment, and they're people like me, and I I made a comment to some friends of mine, some of my colleagues. We were on a symposium the other night at the Centre for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies, and we were talking about this very notion of mobilising wisdom communities. And when I used to work in the refugee and asylum seeker sector, it occurred to me that there was no point talking to refugees and asylum seekers about what future they wanted, because it wasn't actually them that had the power to change their future. I mean, they do in some sense, don't get me wrong. You appreciate what I mean when I say that. It's actually mainstream Australia who are voting in governments who continue to marginalise these people, who continue to use draconian policies to put them on islands and lock them up and put them in places where they weren't seen or heard. And I think that they're the people that I'm interested in talking to most, right? So how do we capture their imaginations? How do we hack their cultures to think there is nothing to be afraid of here, and listening to all these other people? How do we do the thing that Yuda just, I think, so eloquently said, which is to say, open up to the diversity of the world around us? And so I think that's the thing I'm working on at the moment. I'm most interested in working on in the future. And we need to think about how we use language that's more accessible, I think, and language that is more, that is less about making people feel spoken down to and speaking with people, which I guess is quite common sense when you think about, all of the other stuff that we've been speaking about and how we'd approach those other communities. But I think those mainstream voices that are now understanding that actually climate change is happening to all of us, and you can't put your air conditioning on and close the windows and it's going to go away. It's going to hit us all eventually. So we're actually all in this thing together. And so how do we make that a less scary experience for those people that are suddenly starting to realize that, and help them to understand that by opening up to the rest of the world, we potentially have a chance with this thing. Probably not climate change, you said, Yuda, but other stuff. So yeah, that's what I think.
Sort of taking off from where Liam was sort of talking about, I think for me, personally and professionally with the platform and also in my life, I think for me, what I have observed is that there is a complete disintegration of dialogue happening between people. And this is, I think, a global problem. And that's where the trust starts to break down, because you don't have a dialogue. All you have is heated opinions and heated arguments and, your own little lovely echo chambers and confirmation biases. And I think until the time we actually make the effort to go push ourselves, go talk to people who don't agree with us, with whom we don't agree, and we try to understand their narratives, their stories, and put forth our opinions in a way that it is not malicious or driven with a certain agenda that, you have to listen to me. And I'll give you something which is very close to home. Like, my brother is a hardcore supporter of this government. He lives abroad and he's a hardcore supporter of this government in India, and I'm not. And I might get kicked out of the country for having said this now publicly here. Anyway, so it's just, and it is so difficult for me. It was very difficult for me to have conversations with my brother about how hard this is for me and why, and trying to also understand where he comes from. And through dialogue, through a certain amount of process, we have actually reached a certain amount of understanding about why he believes what he believes. And also, we have also reached an agreement that I'm not going to tell you to believe in what I believe. You believe what you believe, you trust what you trust, but this is my belief system and this is what I believe in, my values. And I think sometimes just accepting that people have different value systems goes a long way in building a certain amount of dialogue. And for him, it hit him very close when in the second wave, he saw what was happening in the country. Our entire family got COVID, and he saw how the government's inaction was affecting his own family. And that made him take 2 steps back on his own politics. And, he started wanting to know more about what was actually happening outside of his own little bubble. So I feel like we need to share more. We need to open up more. We need to be more vulnerable also, and be open to other people and their own realities, because people have their own realities. People are living in their own little bubbles, and it's not about piercing the bubble. Honestly, it's all just about entering that bubble, coming out of it, and going back into your bubble, and maybe making a big whole bubble called, I don't know, whatever. But honestly, for me, that's what it is. And I think we are so busy wanting to pierce each other's bubbles, and that's not the point. That's not what a dialogue is, and for me, that's where I really want my work to be, to go forward. Even the platform that we're building, we want to make this a space where we can have dialogue. I don't have to agree with everything that's coming on my platform, and that's okay. And that's okay. That's precisely why it's a platform, because we want diverse voices, we want diverse stories there.
I'll add my thoughts in concluding towards the end. I'm a bit like Liam. I might share something which sounds like unrelated to what I just shared, but actually it's not. At work, one of the big things is when governments talk about wanting to practice anticipatory governance, is actually how saying anticipatory governance at the policy level cannot be had without participation of citizens and without participation of as many diverse groups of your citizenry. And I think actually, as I say citizen, I'm picking on this like footnote asterisk that I'd made for Sophia, which is actually, I feel the word citizen is a very political word because that is not everyone who lives within our communities and our borders is even acknowledged as a citizen. So maybe I say the word and then I put an asterisk noting that actually that's not what I mean and that's limiting sense, but really people who live in our geographies, that governments need to engage with them. But of course, for that, you first need to acknowledge them. But so that's the work side, right? Which is how do we make sure that actually what our governments are doing actually do it in partnership with people, and actually they have so much, they benefit so much by doing it that way, regardless of their political agenda. So that's one. And then on my personal side, actually, I think a lot about, actually, Padma Priya, you're much bolder. I still feel uncomfortable sharing that I have so many family members who have the same ideology differences than I do. And it's really, really challenging. But I've actually been more and more curious in my personal projects to talk about our families. How did we grow up? How did our families have conversations? What are those relational mindsets that we saw exposed to growing up? Maybe some of them are framed by our families, maybe by someone else. For someone like me, a lot of it was my family as a moving family. My family was the one consistent thing. And I've been really, really curious to take a step back and ask people about their families. And so in a personal project I'm working on, I'm actually working on relational mindsets and mental models of our families, and how is that actually influence how insecure we feel, how open to different conversations we feel, how we feel if someone critiques us or criticizes us. Because actually, when I think of what's happening in India right now, sometimes I think growing up, our families did not always as a culture encourage children asking questions, encourage children questioning authority, or children having their own perspectives and viewpoints. And so is that maybe a reason why as adults, we don't actually know the healthy way to have these things because they were never role modeled for us. So anyways, on a personal angle, that's actually a project that I'm trying to unpack as a way to make sense of like some of these things. And yeah, that's on my end. Thanks, everyone.
Yuda, any closing thoughts? And thanks, Prateekha. I want to talk to you about that because living in Bali away from my family for so many months during these times, I've really become keenly aware of family and what it means in a different context. So I've done a lot of observing and just unpacking those things within myself too. So excited for that project. Yuda, one last thought from you. You have 90s, no, I'm just kidding.
I completely
take us home,
agree.
Yuda.
Yeah, South Asian parenting slash past generations represent, it's a whole other nightmare by itself.
Yeah, it's a whole other topic in itself.
Yes, I think, however, like I used to think this was purely a problem of, and we have an altogether completely screwed up version of this. And I was very surprised to see, this same lack of critical thinking, the same lack of the blind acceptance of what I think of as dad wisdom, which is stuff like, as you grow up, your dad says things and you think, oh, right, this is the truth of the universe. And then you grow up and realize he was talking a bunch of shit. And he was probably making up stuff on the spot. And this sort of acceptance of dad wisdom, there seems to be common throughout the world. So, which is just something that surprised me when I looked at it. It wasn't just a problem with our societies. And I'm wondering if there isn't a better way uh, of like what going back to what Liam said, of approaching people who have the power and going, hey, here are narratives, here are other narratives out there, and looking at them and understanding them does not degrade the power of your narrative. In fact, it might even make it stronger. To present an argument that, the more different perspectives you absorb, you're going to be better for it. So do I have any overwhelming solutions to the world? Not at the moment. Still working on that. I'll get back to you. But yes, thank you. So thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for some wonderful thoughts. I absolutely enjoyed this. And I think June is going to definitely end up getting quoted in a book I'm writing.